And I think we are live. Hey, welcome everybody to episode 4 of the Stand to Reason Book Club, where John, Tim, and myself are going through the book, The Universe Next Door by James Sire, which is a book on worldviews. There it is. John's holding it up. Very nice.
This is my contribution to the talk today.
That's right. That's all I'm going to do. So if you're hoping for more, John, you're not going to get it. No, we want more cowbell, but we're not going to get it. We're just going to get John holding that thing up, and that's it. Anyways, thanks for that, John. Just sit there and pay attention to the big boys talk.
and look bald,
which you're so good at doing.
Yes.
Yeah. So we are in episode 4, which I was realizing I kept calling it like week 3, week 4, but that's kind of confusing because we actually meet every other week. So even though this is week 4, it's really like been 8 weeks since we started, I think. Anyways, we are covering today 2 chapters, Nihilism and Existentialism. So that was kind of a big chunk of reading. We were just commenting before we got started that that was a lot of reading, and it was kind of some dense reading. It was intense, But anyways, we're gonna give it our best shot. Again, we're not trying to unpack everything in the chapters, but rather just sort of give our thoughts and reflections on it. So that's kind of where we're headed. Mm-hmm. Let's see here. So we're going to start with chapter 5, which is nihilism. And maybe what I'll do to kick it off is just summarize nihilism. And actually, James Sire gives a really good kind of definition to start with here at the very beginning of the chapter. So he says this: nihilism is more a feeling than a philosophy, more a solitary stance before the universe than a worldview. Strictly speaking, he says, nihilism is a denial of any philosophy or worldview, a denial of the possibility of knowledge, a denial that anything is valuable. And then just skip down a little bit. He says, in other words, nihilism is the negation of everything: knowledge, ethics, beauty, reality. In nihilism, no statement has validity. Nothing has meaning. Everything is gratuitous. The trope, that is, it's just there. Wow, that's depressing.
Let's close in prayer.
Yeah, let's close in prayer, right? Because we need it. Yeah, no. So anyways, I think that nicely kind of captures the essence and, like he says, the feeling that comes with nihilism. But I think that's a nice way to sort of start us off with sort of an understanding of here's what this idea is, and we can probably go from there.
Sure.
John's not going to say anything, right?
Okay.
He's going to look pretty.
No, I'll start.
Yeah, please do.
I'll start. Right off the bat, from that very simple definition, I think we see glaring problems with this, because embedded in the statement itself, the definition itself of what nihilism is a sense of at least some knowledge, some meaning, and some understanding, which this system negates all of those. So in order to communicate the fact that this is a system that lacks any knowledge, for example, that's a knowledge statement. So
it's self-refuting.
It's self-refuting from the get-go, yeah. Which makes discussing it fun, I think.
Yeah, and not only self-refuting, John, but also when you think about things like knowledge, hey, I think I know some things. When I think of ethics, right and wrong, and when I think of beauty and value and meaning, I think most people would say, no, there is meaning in the universe. There are some things that are valuable, yeah, and beautiful and morally good and morally evil. So this, I right off the bat, nihilism seems to just buck up against our experience of the world. Yeah. And it just doesn't sound right. I mean, when you read that statement, it just, something within me wants to cry, no, none of that's true. None of that's right. That's not my experience. So there's self-refuting. It seems to run counter to what most people take to be true at this level. Of course, we're going to go into these things and actually show, yeah, that feeling that we have that they're not true, that's right, because it can't make sense of some very important aspects of reality. Yeah.
I think one thing also to point out that's important, especially relative to our whole series here, is that the last chapter we discussed. Well, actually, I take that back. That was I'm sorry. We covered Marxism last time, but that's because Marxism fell within the chapter on naturalism.
Yeah.
And one of the points that Sire makes here is that nihilism is the natural child of nihilism is the natural child of naturalism. It's too many N words. Nihilism is the natural child of naturalism. In other words, if you accept the naturalistic worldview that there is no God, there is no soul, there's no angels, there's no demons, there's no life after death, we're just annihilated at the end of our physical earthly existence, then he says we live in a universe that's devoid of meaning, that's devoid of value, that's devoid of ethics. And of course, that's the point he's making, is that if you accept naturalism, this is the natural outworking of that worldview, that ultimately nothing is valuable, nothing is meaningful. And there's no point to life. There's, what is beautiful, what is ethical, what is nothing. It's all just, like he says, we're just there, we exist, and that's pretty much it.
Mm.
So it makes sense that he puts this chapter right after the chapter on naturalism, because he's kind of working through a logical outflowing of these ideas.
Yeah, and maybe before we even get into some of the specifics here, it might be important to point out that, most people, and I think we've talked about this before, most people that have adopted a naturalistic worldview, they don't follow this out consistently. They haven't thought through their naturalism to the point where they even know what nihilism is. Okay. What Sire is doing here is he's just saying, look, here's the consistency. Here's what happens when you're a naturalist. And of course, in the second half of the program here, we're going to talk about another philosophy, or we might call it worldview, existentialism, that tries to get out from under this nihilism. Okay, because people don't like this implication, what naturalism leads to, and so we got to try to figure out a way to avoid the conclusions here. And so that's where we're going to head. But if you just follow naturalism to its conclusion, this is what you get, and it's not pretty. Sadly, though, most people aren't thinking very deeply about this stuff, and so they don't even know what nihilism is. So,
Tim, to go to your point, you remind me of probably, I think, my favorite section in this chapter, which is on page 102, and it goes right to the point you're talking about, which is that most naturalists don't, think consistently with their worldview and its implications. So, right in the middle of that page 102, he says, why then aren't most naturalists? So this is after the point he makes about naturalism leads to nihilism. Yeah. He says, well, why then aren't most naturalist nihilists? He says, the obvious answer is the best one. And that is, most naturalists do not take their naturalism seriously. They are inconsistent. And then, which is definitely my favorite line in the whole chapter here, a few sentences later, he says, Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. But for the naturalist, he is wrong. For a naturalist, it is the examined life that is not worth living. I was just like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. That was a mic drop kind of moment there.
It was.
Because it's true. When you think through this, right? I thought about tweeting that out, but I worried that people would take it wrong. Like I was trying to say to the naturalist, you should just go kill yourself, that kind of thing. But no, so you got to understand the context of what you've just read, right? To understand where it's coming from.
Yeah.
But yeah, as soon as the naturalist starts to examine the tenets of naturalism, you're left with a life that really is not worth living. Because there's no meaning, there's no purpose, there's no value. It's just what is, just existence.
One of the things I really like about talking about this type of stuff, like worldview stuff in general, especially centered around naturalism, is when the atheists or the materialists, when they are honest. There are some that are honest about their view. Do you guys have you heard the name William Provine?
Yeah.
And I have a great quote from him. It's not from the book, but I just use it in my suicide talk, and my talk on defeating naturalism, and it's really powerful. He says, "Let me summarize my views on what the modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. And I must say that these are basically Darwin's views. There are no gods, no purposeful forces of any kind, no life after death. When I die, I'm absolutely certain that I'm going to be completely dead. That's just all. It's going to be the end of me. There's no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no free will for humans either." Yeah. And at least he's honest here. I mean, it's bleak and it's not true, but at least he's honest. And then what nihilism does is it takes that naturalism, that truth that we just heard from him, takes it a step further. So it's kind of like, for me, I say nihilism is naturalism lived out. Mm-hmm. And when you start to pursue that, when you start to pursue your naturalism in a logically consistent way, it doesn't go anywhere good fast. Yeah. I mean, you speed down the highway of just, a wreck of a life, and you wreck other people's lives in the process.
So why don't we kind of investigate some of those things, right? And I think that as people watch, and if they want to participate, they can leave comments and messages in the comment section, the chat, and we'll respond. But I think, Alan started by reading that definition. There's a feeling, right, that happens when you start to examine this stuff. And I think as we go through and we start looking at free will, and we start looking at ethics, and we start looking at epistemology, what we know, what we can know, given naturalism, you start to feel certain things. And this is kind of what I think nihilism is getting at. So let's why don't we start with this first bridge. He starts to talk about necessity and chance in that first section.
I do have a skill you might like.
Sorry.
Is that Alexa?
She's always listening, man.
Sorry about that.
We actually just got an Alexa. Is that what that was?
Yeah, I have an Alexa show in my office here, so I could video chat to my family and the rest of my house, and
nice.
I have her on silent. She doesn't obey commands very well, but I actually had I had her silent. I always put her on silent before I go live with anything. But
it's Big Brother, man.
Yeah, she's just busting through those barriers,
Well, there might be a segue here, okay? Because we're about to talk about determinism and free will. And actually, this is kind of funny that this came up, because my kids talk to Alexa. We just got one, as if it's a real person, as if it is making decisions. My 7-year-old asked Alexa the other day, "Are we friends?" And it's just so funny to see them interact with essentially a robot who has been pre-programmed. I mean, it's AI technology, but a programmer is behind how she responds to certain things, right?
I think this is more of a parenting problem than it is a free will problem.
But we're gonna talk about this problem of free will that it's not a problem for us, but for the naturalist, and what they're left with is determinism. So I don't know if you guys want to jump in and we can start chatting about that.
Well, he kind of addresses this point in the chapter on naturalism. So that's where he introduces the idea that under the naturalistic worldview, you only have physical things, and physical things by definition don't have the capacity to have free will. So he fleshes this out a lot more in this particular chapter, because if we don't have free will, this really raises the question about the question of whether there's meaning or to anything that we do, So that's I think its relevance in this particular chapter, even though the idea that we have no possibility of free will under a naturalistic worldview falls within the broader, specifically the category of naturalism.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's going to say, he says in the book that, if the proposition or presupposition is true that we're all just materialistic, that means everything is just at its ends a result of a naturalistic, materialistic process. And if that's true, that means everything, including our actions, our thoughts, are just purely a response to a prior event.
Mm-hmm.
And that event is just a response to another prior event, and so on and so forth. And I mean, there's a multiple of problems with this. My major issue that my mind just goes right to, I think it's the simplest problem, is what was that first event? Like, what's the first event? Because in order to have an event, you have to have in order to have something happen, you have to have something cause it.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, he just said it's an infinite, it's an infinite event. And if it's an infinite event, then how did we get to today? Because we can't possibly, I don't think, traverse an actual infinite number of events. So It kind of hangs itself there too, huh?
Yeah, you need something, because he's talking about a closed system, right? And so goes to the kind of a first cause argument. You need something outside the closed system, given arguments, against an infinite regress, that causes the closed system. And so you end up with something outside the system, which, on my view, sounds a lot like God. Again, this is an argument for God's existence we could go over. But there's, to bring it home with nihilism is that, look, if there's, like, as you just described, it's just an event causing another event, and he describes how, we can calculate, scientists can calculate when the next solar eclipse is going to be on our planet. And Alan, we were chatting about this, and they can calculate the next solar eclipse or next eclipse on other planets that have suns and, this kind of thing. And so, to precision. Mm-hmm. And this is because cause and effect. Well, imagine, now play this out, not just with, the next eclipse, but the next act that you're going to do. And if we knew all the causes, well, then we could, that influence your actions, we could figure out the effect. And so the idea is, everything is determined. It's all dominoes falling. It's all cause and effect. And if that's true, then we're stuck in this determinism, which at the end of the day means that there is no freedom. There is no moral responsibility, because I couldn't do otherwise anyways, right? Whatever's going to be will be. Just like the solar eclipse has that sun, that planet has no, that whole arrangement has no other options given the laws of physics and how things are going to line up. And so there's almost like you just throw your hands up. That's just how it is, right? And so when you think of the next atrocity that happens, we can complain, but could there be any other option? No, because everything was determined. And it was determined way back, John, like you just said, by events that happened way before humanity ever came on the scene, right? If you play this out. So that's, to me, a serious problem.
Yeah. And so what you're saying there, Tim, if it's the next atrocity, or I don't know what you had in mind in particular, but let's just say it's like a mass shooting or something like that. Well, then this raises the question, if they really aren't truly free to make a decision about shooting someone or not, then how do we hold these people morally accountable, right? And that gets addressed in, I think, the third bridge as well. But yeah, so if we have no free will, how are we accountable to anything that we've done? Because we haven't done it. It's just a matter of, physics and chemistry just sort of playing itself out in our brains, and we just act, but it's not on our own volition. So how can we be accountable for that? How can anybody be accountable for anything? So I think on page 90, he captures, I think, the significance of how a lack of free will is a part of, leads to this sort of nihilistic feeling, which is embedded in the idea of naturalism. And he says here on page 90, human beings are conscious machines without the ability to affect their own destiny or do anything significant. Therefore, human beings as valuable beings are dead. I mean, that perfectly, I think, captures the nihilistic implications of naturalism leading to the inability to have free will, basically.
Yeah. That's good.
All right. So should we jump to the second bridge that he talks about?
Sure.
The great cloud of unknowing. So this is about epistemological uncertainty, right? Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, he says on 93 about this, naturalism holds that perception and knowledge are either identical with or a byproduct of the brain, right? So there's nothing outside the physical realm, so there's no room for the mind. They arise from functioning of matter. Without matter's functioning, there would be no thought. But matter functions by a nature of its own, which I don't even know what that means. I guess it's just, it's like you tip that first domino over, and now everything's just a succession of the next domino, the next domino, the next domino. There's no reason to think that matter has any interest in leading a conscious being to true perception or to logic that is correct, or logical that is correct conclusions based on accurate observations and true presuppositions. So not only is knowledge, like there's no room for knowledge on this worldview, but it's not only that, there's no truth. There's just no such thing as truth. Like, why would we believe that our faculties would do anything true, or we come to any true conclusion on this worldview? It's not good.
Yeah, John. So it's interesting you say that. When I was reading this, a lot of my thoughts came to some things that you address a lot, especially on page 96, when he's still in the whole section about epistemological uncertainty. But towards the bottom of page 96, he says, one of the worst consequences of taking epistemological nihilism seriously is that it has led some to question the very facticity of the universe. To some, nothing's real, not even themselves. Yeah. People who reach this state are in deep trouble, for they can no longer function as human beings, or as we often say, they can't cope. And I read that and I just thought to myself that anybody who's deeply immersed and is considering this and is experiencing this nihilistic feeling would be a risk for suicide, And I was just wondering, because you've done so much thinking and writing and speaking about suicide, that I'm sure all throughout this chapter, it was just like screaming like, yes, this is horrible. Like, one of the reasons we wouldn't want somebody to accept this kind of a thinking is that it would tragically lead to suicide, or it could.
Yeah. Well, it certainly is a direct attack on two main things, right? Meaning of life, and also identity. So, and that bleeds, the identity question bleeds over into the existentialism chapter, which we'll get to hopefully in a little bit. Yeah. But the human mind becomes unable to cope with the world around it, and what happens is ultimately you end up constructing, at least in your mind, a false reality. And that reality is a mess because you don't have anything to ground anything on. So I mean, literally, there's nothing to grab hold of that you can say is truth. This is true. The world might be spinning around me, but I have this. At least in I think naturalism, obviously logically followed and lived out to its logical conclusions, ends here. But at least on a soft kind of naturalism or topic naturalism, you have certain things that are grounded. Science. Okay, I can hold on to science. I know science is true, or whatever it is that you've constructed as that pole of reality for you. But when you traverse over from naturalism into nihilism, everything loses any objective, even sense. Nihilism is a complete rejection of any objective meaning, purpose, morality, identity, destiny, anything. Even it's even a direct attack on our sense of wonder and awe at the world around us. So now you start doing attacks on your joy and your happiness. So that's when we start seeing, when people buy full force into this worldview, oftentimes we'll see people that get to the very pinnacle of their life, what they think is going to deliver the ultimate. It's that thing that they've placed their objective hope into. And when they get there, it's just fleeting, and that's what leads people into despair and ultimate nihilism. But yeah, this whole chapter, I have like notes all over it on suicide. Like it's a real concern. I think it's a real concern.
Yeah. So, it's so fascinating the way you described it. Like a minute ago, you said that if there is, they can't cope, so they look for something to hold on to or grab onto, and they create like an alternate sense of reality. You said something like that. Is that right?
Well, they look to something. On nihilism, yeah. But even their. So the external world loses meaning, purpose, and form for the most part. And then when you turn inward into nihilism, even your dreams, like your hopes, your aspirations, the thing that are deeply embedded in you, those lose complete meaning. So now not only do you have I'm not saying materialistic as in like the worldview, but a materialistic, view of reality. Like I need that car, that house, that job, that woman, that whatever. That's where I'm going to put my meaning in. Not only is that gone, which I think goes with, but then with nihilism, but then all of a sudden it's a direct attack on the stuff that's inside too. Your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, your joy, your peace, your happiness. Mm-hmm. And then you're left with, and the way that I say it is like the only thing you're really left with, it's not even suicide, to be honest with you, because when you die by suicide, when somebody dies by suicide, even in that act, there's built into it some semblance of meaning, right? You're doing something and it means something. And it doesn't maybe make sense. But then on nihilism, that act doesn't even make sense. What you should really be doing is you should just lay down where you are and just stay there forever until you die, ultimately probably of like starvation or something, or if you're outside like a wild animal or whatever. I mean, that's ultimate nihilism lived out. And I think the reason why it's important to be discussing these things is because these thoughts and ideas have influenced, the 20th century, magisterium, the academic elites. And this is the stuff, naturalism into nihilism is what the majority of our educational institutions are teaching, or at least what they're teaching is very seriously affected by it. So I don't know if that even answers your question. I just
no, it does. I
wasn't supposed to talk this session.
That's true. You weren't. Just look bald. But no, I appreciate that insight, because after he mentions that point about how people can't cope if this is kind of what their thinking is, he says that we typically, as a society, don't recognize people who are experiencing that. Yeah. He says, because rather we call what they're experiencing, and he names it as schizophrenia, hallucination, daydreaming, or living in a dream. In other words, these people might end up institutionalized because if they just live consistently that way and think that's all there is to reality, which is nothingness.
Yeah. And I thought Sire was really good here, because one of the things that we have to be careful of, one of the things that I'm careful of is not to negate mental health issues, right? I mean, these issues are prevalent. They do exist, and medication helps. But at the same time, when we think about it, so if we live in a purely naturalistic world, we live in a time in history and in our society, certainly the West, where we understand the brain better than we ever have. We have medications to treat these things like multiple personality disorder, schizophrenia, hallucinations, better than we ever have in the course of human history. Yet rates of suicide, rates of depression, and all these stuff are skyrocketing. Well, if we were living in a purely naturalistic world, we would expect to see the opposite, I think, but there's something else going on here. And I think that Sire's getting at that, where sometimes we say somebody's schizophrenic. Sometimes we say that they're, fantasizing or daydreaming, or we put them in an institution, when that's not really what's happening. They've bought wholesale into a worldview that doesn't reflect reality. And that's like what when you start living that out, I think that's when you start calling people insane, right? When you're insane, it's when your beliefs and your thoughts don't line up with the way the world really is. And then there's a diagnosis that comes with that. And again, I'm not saying for anybody who's watching that the depression isn't severe and medication doesn't help. But I like Sire here that he was measured on that. That was on 96, the bottom of 96. He was good.
Yeah, that's a good distinction, because what we're talking about is thinking through implications of worldview, right? And where that can lead someone into something that's mentally unhealthy. But then there's also this other side of things there's chemical issues and so on that need to be treated responsibly. And it may not have anything to do with them thinking through their worldview. It's them, it's just something going chemically wrong in the brain.
Yeah.
That needs to be treated.
And like worldviews matter. And I think that's kind of the point of our whole series. They really do matter. Everybody has a worldview. I love the way Sire addressed it, and he addresses it throughout every chapter. We might hold to a worldview, but we might not actually believe that world. We might not live that worldview out. Mm-hmm. And worldviews matters. And I can just, and this is totally anecdotal. I never use this as an argument for the existence of God or why Christianity is superior to naturalism. But I know from experience that when I was a naturalist, living in Hollywood, making good money at a law firm, by the world's standards, I was doing very, very well. But I started pursuing my naturalism in a very logical or logically consistent way. And it led to the borders of nihilism. And like, I can't even share half the stories because I'm embarrassed by them of where it led. And you might want to, people who are watching who are maybe naturalists, they don't usually like it when I say this because it's just one man's experience. And I totally grant that. But I was logically consistent with my worldview. And it led to gnarly places. I mean, I look back on the things I was doing and I'm just like, what in the world? Even while I was doing them, I knew it was wrong and I knew it was destructive and I knew I was leaving wreckage in my wake. Mm-hmm. And that's ultimately what made me reconsider it was these bumps that Tim, you brought it up, I think at the very beginning, like these bumps into reality. Then here, certainly free will, yes, but then also, the idea of living in a morally deep world. Like when you wrong somebody, you've wronged them, and there's no room for that on naturalism. Certainly, once you start leaning into nihilism, so worldviews matter, guys. Like they really do.
Just going back to something we said, we got a comment here, a couple comments from Glenn, Shaver, and says cause and effect, because we were talking about cause and effect a moment ago before we got on the whole knowledge area, epistemology. He said cause and effect, however, there is choice. When there's a choice, there's a consequence. When there's a consequence, then there's a rule of law of consecration, correct? I don't know if I follow exactly the question, but what we were saying was there's cause and effect, and then people are making choices, but they're not choices like you're probably thinking of. It feels like free choice, but it's not free choice. It's that what you're doing, what we call a choice on naturalism, is simply the effect of some prior cause. And that cause is the effect of a prior cause. And so of course, the naturalist talks about choices, but those aren't real choices in the sense that they are determined. It's not like a free will kind of choice. It is a determined choice, just like, and that's why we use the illustration. That's why Sire uses the illustration of an eclipse. The eclipse just happens every so many years or whatever. And that is just how, because of the laws of physics, right? You could say there's a choice that there's an eclipse, but that would just be weird language. There isn't really a choice. It's just, that's what happens, cause and effect.
I think people sometimes, when they think about this, they think, well, we're just, our brain and so complicated. We must have free will somewhere like stuck up there somewhere. But the way I always try to illustrate this is I start from something that's far more simple. So I say, look, if you got, some billiard balls, on a pool table, well, the movement of those billiard balls is determined by prior states of physics, right? Like one billiard ball hits one and it bounces off, the side of the pool table and bounces around. And like none of those billiard balls have the capacity to, on their own free will, decide to stop or change direction. Why? Because they're merely physical objects. We'll take something more complex, like a stapler. More complex than a billiard ball, but at the end of the day, it's still just a physical object. So it can't have the capacity to just start stapling on its own. It has no free will ability. We'll take something more complicated than a stapler, like a car. A car, it's certainly more complex than a stapler, but at the end of the day, it's also just a physical object and simply just does what it does based on prior states of physics. And now we're going to introduce chemistry because obviously there's combustion and gasoline and fire and whatever, right? But it can't decide to do whatever it wants on its own. I mean, it might seem like it can because we program it or, we make a Tesla that can drive on its own. But at the end of the day, it doesn't have free will in the sense that we're talking about because it's just programmed to do something. Well, now take something more complicated like your brain. Still more complex than a car and a stapler and a billiard ball. But at the end of the day, if our brain is just a physical object, just like every other thing that we just talked about, then we might appear to have the capacity for free will, but we can't. Because if we're just physical, all our decisions are based on prior states of physics and chemistry, And so when you kind of do this sort of incremental approach and you begin with something that's clearly just physical and you move up to something that's also still physical, like our brains and our bodies and who we are as humans, again, on the naturalistic worldview, there's no capacity there for free will choices apart from the effects of physics and chemistry on our brain and consequently our decisions.
That's a really good illustration, Alan. And I think when you start carrying that out, the reason why this stuff matters is when we start talking about the moral realm, oughtness. And I love, and then not only just the moral realm, but the idea of guilt and innocence and justice ultimately. I love on page 100 down at the bottom, it says, in a universe where God is dead, people are not guilty of violating moral law. They're only guilty of guilt. And that's very serious, for nothing can be done about it. And I really liked that saying. And I actually brought my mind to critical race theory, and how does this worldview play? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because what does it mean on critical race theory to be guilty? It has absolutely nothing to do with anything I've done, and even the solution to it, there's no retribution. So I'm not guilty of anything. I'm just guilty of guilt.
Yeah.
And then how do you escape that?
Yeah.
I don't think you can.
Great connection. It's a great point. And here, John's appropriately segued to that third section there of the third bridge, which begins on page 97, is and ought. Just because something is the way it is doesn't mean it ought to be. And so, yeah, that's the point John's bringing up here and extrapolating a little bit, which Sire makes the point here on the top of page 98, which explains this section. Remember that for the naturalist, the world is merely there. It does not provide humanity with a sense of oughtness. It only is. Ethics, however, is about what we ought to be, whether it is or not. Where then does one go for a basis for morality? Where is oughtness found? Again, in light of nihilism, which is a part of course, the naturalistic worldview. So, yeah, I love that's a great connection, John. I didn't think about that, but that's a good point.
Yeah, it's crazy.
All right, so we could jump to existentialism because we're about 40 minutes in, or unless we have another thought. Does one of you have another thought about?
Well, I would just add and reiterate that on nihilism, ultimately, I think the major violence it does is it strips us of meaning and identity. ultimately. And that actually segues into, I think, existentialism. But I love the quote here, 101, where Sire says, the strands of epistemological, metaphysical, and ethical nihilism weave together to make a rope long enough and strong enough to hang a whole culture.
Yeah.
The name of that rope is loss of meaning.
Oh,
Yeah, that's pretty hardcore, dude.
Yeah.
Sire's not pulling any punches.
Yeah.
You know.
Lindsay makes the point here. This sounds just like a non-accountability worldview, which I agree. That's what it sounds like, right? Easy X, I have nothing substantial to say except that it sounds so much like the Buddhist concept of the non-self. Yeah, that's an interesting kind of parallel, and we're going to touch on that in 2 weeks when we cover pantheism.
And actually, Sire makes that exact same point. He says early on in the chapter that, we're just part of the system, right? This naturalistic system. There is no ego. There is no self.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're probably going to see some of overlap when we study Buddhism and look at, and I think we're going to see a lot of naturalism in there.
Right. So yeah, thanks for commenting, guys. We appreciate that. All right, Tim. Anything else besides John's final comment on nihilism? We jump
just again. We talked about this before, but the cumulative effect of these, and he just brought up 3. There's more devastating consequences, but when we look at no free will, just determinism. When we look at in the area of epistemology, there is no way to really ground knowing. Okay, and we didn't talk about it, but this is Alvin Plantinga. He brings up this kind of this evolutionary naturalist. What does he call it? Argument. It's an evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Right.
And basically, the argument is that evolution, naturalistic evolution, has not. We haven't evolved to produce true beliefs, but merely just survival. In fact, sometimes what's true isn't what's adaptive, right? And I mean, this isn't controversial, I don't think. Lots of atheists agree on this point. Steven Pinker makes a very similar point. Charles Darwin is quoted in the book, and his horrid doubt is that why should we trust our convictions?
Mm-hmm.
And he compares them to the convictions of a monkey's mind, right? If a monkey has any convictions. And C.S. Lewis makes a similar argument. How do we even trust our own thinking? And so that's the second point. So you got the free will thing. You have this. Well, how do we know anything? And then finally, this. And to me, the strongest argument is this argument against any kind of morality. At least objective morality. You can't get an ought from an is. And so when you put those 3 things together, this to me is just devastating to the nihilistic, in particular, the naturalistic worldview. And so we've talked about this in the past.
Right.
Yeah. We could talk on nihilism for hours. We haven't even touched on its effects on the arts and the pursuit of any type of a meaningful life.
Yeah, which Sire gets into actually in really interesting ways. So if you are curious about that, definitely read that chapter. Because like John said, we didn't address a whole bunch of stuff that he mentions, which is really good stuff. We actually all, I think, agreed that we preferred the nihilism chapter over the existentialism chapter, which is the reason why it's only going to get now 16 minutes of our comments.
The short shrift.
Yeah. So chapter 6, existentialism, is on page 107.
That would be a name for a really good book, Tim. Like a very short trip into existentialism.
Yeah. I don't want to write that.
Yeah.
There is, before you go on though, there is a comment here from Jonathan, and I don't know if any of you guys want to weigh in on this, but he says, what has been the best defense from atheists on the topic of free will? And it depends what Jonathan means. I mean, Sam Harris has written on this specifically, but his argument isn't trying to defend free will. He argues that we don't really have free will. So there's been defenses like that, that we call it free will and we act like we're free, but it's really an illusion. And so there's been different atheists who have made that kind of argument. So, Daniel Dennett has made a similar kind of argument, Sam Harris. As far as like an atheist arguing for a free will that a theist would argue for, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I don't know either.
I don't think that it's certainly not consistent with naturalism. So it'd have to be an atheist who doesn't hold to naturalism.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. If I'm talking to an atheist who's defending free will, I'd let them describe what they mean, and then they bear the burden of showing how through a random mutation is a purely naturalistic process, free will arises. I wouldn't bear the burden.
Yeah. All right, so we definitely need to get to existentialism now.
Do we really?
Yeah, I know we're trying to avoid. Oh, look, another comment about the previous chapter.
Well, it's just yeah. There's not going to be much to say, and just because we're not ignoring Ryan here, he's asked a couple of times about Calvinism, and we're not going to. That literally would take us into another hour. But
hour.
He says, I don't want to hijack the live stream. And that would hijack it. In particular, because there are differing views represented here, right?
Yeah.
If Calvinism is true, how can we have free will? And so there would be different ways to cash out free will from either libertarian
compatibilistic
versus a compatibilistic, which is compatible with determinism. There are differences. I mean, so
So are we avoiding existentialism by going into Calvinism?
No, I don't want to go. I don't want to go into Calvinism. Maybe we'll do a whole stream on that. We'll get Coco in here because he has some weird views.
He's so good.
And that would be a cool discussion.
Yeah.
But,
whatever Coco says, I agree with.
Besides, we're not all Calvinists on this live stream. So
yeah,
okay.
That's the thing. Yeah.
Okay, so existentialism. One of the things we kind of were talking about before we started broadcasting live is we weren't exactly sure how best to define existentialism, because the definition seemed a little bit elusive, but so that was kind of a problem. But let's see, what did we say? Oh, I know. One of the goals that Sire makes that existentialism tries to achieve is to transcend nihilism. In other words, you arrive at a nihilistic place and then you try to figure out, okay, now what do I do with that? And that, in a sense, is kind of what he was saying existentialism is about, trying to transcend nihilism.
This stuff drives me nuts which is in and of itself not nihilistic. If you're seeking to transcend nihilism, you're not a nihilist. Because there's nothing to transcend. That's why this stuff is so almost. It's just for some reason this stuff I can't wrap my mind around it. Like I really want to, but when I listen to it, it's like, oh man, what are you really saying here? What are you really saying? Because what you're saying is proving itself false as you're saying it.
Yeah. Something that jumped out to me was on page 114, where he's quoting Jean-Paul Sartre. He says, to say that we invent values means nothing else than this. Life has no meaning a priori. Before you come alive, life is nothing. It's up to you to give it meaning.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of like, okay, yeah. So nihilism, you come to you start at naturalism, you come to nihilism, then you try to figure out, okay, well, how do I create meaning? And it's up to you to create that meaning. And all I could think of whenever I hear that is, basically it's like existentialism is one giant placebo, right? So a placebo is, you're given, say, a pill, which you're told, helps treat something, but in reality, it's just a sugar pill. And you take it thinking that it's giving you actual cure or something valuable, but it's not. It's just you believe it is giving you something worthwhile, but it actually isn't. So that would be a placebo pill, right? And this is what existentialism seems to scream to me based on the way many of its advocates articulate it. It's just a giant placebo, right? You don't actually have meaning, but you just invent your own and believe yourself to have meaning, which is just a sad state of affairs if that's really all that it is.
Well, it's also exhausting. I think it's an exhausting way to live. Nietzsche uses the example of a courageous man, right? So is the man who doubts his courage, the way that he's going to prove if he's a courageous man is simply by, doing courageous things. So it's more of this, you just prove yourself, who you are, your identity, your meaning, your worth through your actions. But as we all know, me personally, I feel like lately, especially, I spend the majority of my time failing than succeeding at a lot of stuff. And if that's the nature of reality, then that would make me a failure ultimately. There's part of what Nietzsche and then Sire's reiterating is sounds really great, right? So we can make ourselves anything we want, right? Pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And there's a part of that resonates that I really do like. But at the end of the day, if I'm honest with myself, my own efforts can only go so far. And every day I fail my wife, I fail my kids in not huge ways normally, but if I'm defined by my work, then that's where I ultimately have to turn for my identity. That I'm constantly just trying to measure up and live to a standard that is unreachable ultimately. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it's really good. I appreciate that. Yeah, it reminds me. Have you guys heard JP? So JP Moreland's like my hero. Have you guys heard him share that story about one mug? It's like he describes this like fictitious character named One Mug, who is basically has an IQ of something like 5 or 10, something really low. He's just very ignorant, very unknowledgeable. But some university like UCLA, I think he went to USC, so he makes fun of UCLA. Anyways, so he says, imagine the faculty of UCLA plays a prank on One Mug where they pretend he's like the smartest guy ever, and they give him all these accolades. They put him up on stage and have him lecture, but he doesn't even know like basic arithmetic. They applaud when he says things. And, he's flown across the planet to different countries to consult on, particle physics and whatever, when he doesn't know anything. And the point he makes is like this person, One Mug, is given every sense of feeling worthwhile, valuable, meaningful, intelligent, whatever, but it's all just fake. And he asks the question at the end of the story. He says, would you like to be One Mug? And, anyone who thinks about that from like, no, you'd never want to be that, because it's the ultimate in a perception that your life is meaningful and full of value and significance, but in reality actually has nothing, And to me, that's what this chapter screamed all day long, it's a big placebo. It's all fake. It's a placebo, and it's only intended to give you the perception of value, but it actually doesn't have any.
Yeah.
If you ever hear JP tell a story, it's just a joy just to listen to him say it.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that before. That's really good.
Yeah. Oh, you had nothing to say. I got something else to say.
Well, Tim keeps freezing.
Is Tim gone? No, we didn't lose Tim on the live stream, did we?
Here, let me. Can you guys see me?
Yeah,
I sure can.
Moment, or you just were in deep thought?
Well, I'm going to remove my picture here and maybe change connection to a different speed here, because I don't know what's going on. So, Alan, you keep going.
Okay. So I so John, Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just laughing.
I was going to say, in the previous chapter, you made that really interesting and provocative connection with naturalism and sort of the guilt that comes with it, and how that's sort of connected to, say, critical theory and sort of the way it deals with it. So I thought of something as well with this. So now in this chapter, so with existentialism, you have atheistic existentialism and you have theistic existentialism. So so atheistic existentialism is one thing, and I don't want to talk about that for a moment, but I was more intrigued by something that he mentions about basic theistic existentialism on page 121, I think it is, yeah. He says that Christianity had lost its... So before I say what I'm thinking here, or before I quote him, to me, when I read something, when I read a part of this, I thought of that there was hints of progressive Christianity in this particular expression of theistic existentialism. He says there was a response to a Christianity that had lost its theology completely and had settled for a watered-down gospel of morality and good works. God had been reduced to Jesus, who had been reduced to a good man, pure and simple. And I just remember reading that and just thinking about how I wonder if like this type of thinking was eventually a precursor to a lot of liberal, liberation theology or progressive Christianity, where, there's this sort of downplaying of God and, who he is, and the Old Testament God is, abusive and whatever. And we just talk about Jesus and his good works and his social justice and all that stuff. To me, I don't know, for some reason, many parts throughout this chapter, I kept thinking that same sort of thing, Also, I think on page 133, similar comment, he says, Sire says, so long as those who would be believers in God yearn for a faith that does not demand too much belief in the supernatural or the accuracy of the Bible, theistic existentialism will be a live option. I don't know, like a lot of these comments just scream to me like, yeah, this is like the beginnings of sort of progressive Christianity or liberation theology. And anyways, so that was my interesting connection there to try to rival John's critical theory with naturalism thing. That was a good one.
Yeah, there's not much new under the sun. And so neo-orthodoxy, liberalism, what we're now seeing with progressive Christianity, there's a lot of common thread that's woven between these things. And so it's just interesting. I mean, the same responses that were given to liberalism of the early 20th century, we could be using for the early 21st century, using some of these same arguments. There's the denial of the supernatural in some cases. I mean, some were even denying the resurrection, and of course, I think part of this is because of a mistaken view of truth. And so they're just, well, the ideas here are true, but there is no foundation to it. Like there wasn't really a resurrection. Of course, this runs counter to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ has not been raised, then our faith is futile. We're still in our sins. So Paul wasn't just talking about some kind of myth or some kind of idea divorced from reality. He was actually talking about a real historical event. But they deny the history. That's one of the marks of theistic existentialism. And we're seeing that today too. When you read Elisa Childers' book, Another Gospel, you see example after example of this, denying that we could even trust the Bible. And so you end up creating a theology of your own. And if you like the resurrection, hey, you can keep it. If you don't, no big deal. It's not going to make any difference. So yeah, I'm glad he included that theistic existentialism, because there's a lot of parallels, even though most people probably hadn't heard that term before. there's a lot. We see that going on today. That was a good point, Alan.
Yeah, and it's here to stay. And he makes that point towards the end of the chapter. Though it's hard to discuss and kind of ground, I think it's because it's largely based in subjective feelings, right? There's the objective realm of logic and reason, and then there's the subjective realm of everything else, and those two shall not meet on this philosophy. But it influences, like Alan said, progressive Christianity, because it's all feelings based. It's a subjective view of the world. How you're doing is reality, and who are you to tell me my reality is wrong ultimately. So it's here to stay for sure.
Yeah, and one of the things we do at Stand to Reason is we show that there isn't a lower story and an upper story. You guys seen that? Is it total truth or?
Which it's Schaeffer ultimately.
Yeah, it's total,
Okay.
Piercy meant, but it's
Nancy Piercy gets the idea from Francis Schaeffer, and in the kind of in the main floor you got science, logic, reason, all those things, and then what people do is they stuff religion and morality up into the upper story, and those are they're kept completely separate. And what we're saying is no, when it comes to morality and religion, these are objective features of reality, and so they can be tested using other means, not necessarily science, but certainly logic. When it comes to the world religions out there, and when it comes to morality, there's again, this isn't new. These are the kind of things that Schaeffer was dealing with years ago, decades ago, and the apologists of today are going to have to deal with them, and the ones of tomorrow will have to deal with them too.
Yeah. Schaeffer was so good. I think, Alan, you brought up his in the Christian Manifesto. He talks about how a Christian views everything in bits and pieces. I think you read the last time we were together. You read from that.
Yeah.
It's so true. So that's what's happening now is also the Christian, what we're doing, because we don't view reality as full orbed, everything all together under the umbrella of the Christian worldview. We sometimes borrow from other worldviews and become synchronistic. And that's ultimately what progressive Christianity is, right? So they borrow from liberalism, they borrow from existentialism, and intertwine and interweave it into their Christian worldview, where now it's, in certain instances, it's no longer recognizable as Christianity. So we want to make sure that we put on a full orbed understanding of what Christianity is on top of all of reality. Stop viewing things in bits and pieces.
Right. Which is the whole reason we're doing this particular book, right? The Universal Store Basic Worldview Catalog, because we want people to, and myself as well, ourselves, we want us to be able to think in worldviews, in whole systems. So yeah, very good. All right. We're just over an hour. So any final thoughts before we wrap it up and point people to next episode? Are you guys good? I like the way John ended it.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to be speaking the whole time. He spoke a lot.
Here, this is my final thought.
Did you type that in somewhere? I don't even see where that is.
Oh man, you got to learn the tricks of the trade, Alan.
Yeah.
Oh, you're just like hacking our system here.
Hacking, yeah. No.
Inventing heresy.
You can do tons of cool stuff in here.
Yeah, I guess so. Okay, well, that's it for our 2 chapters for today. Next time, which will not be next week, but in 2 weeks, November 5th, we will be covering chapter 7, Eastern Pantheistic Monism. So pantheism, basically. So I know Buddhism and Hinduism will, of course, be covered in there. I'm actually looking forward to that one because that's definitely a huge dominant worldview in our culture. Again, that'll be in 2 weeks.
Should we watch Avatar as a homework assignment?
That's right. Yeah,
I've never seen that.
You never seen it?
No. It was out in the movie theater when Rihanna was pregnant with Eva, our first.
Yeah.
And I tried to go see that thing like 5 times. No, it was probably the last time I was going to go see a movie in a long time.
Right.
And it was sold out everywhere. I stood like 25 minutes in the rain to get tickets. And when I got to the front, it was sold out. I was like, forget it.
Well, I remember it was groundbreaking for its 3D technology, and it was. I remember when I first saw it, thinking, "Wow, that was." They did a 3D job. They did a 3D effect very, very well at the time.
Yeah.
Now, I think everybody considers 3D a gimmick, but that's certainly something that helped bring it.
James Cameron came up with that technology, I think.
Yeah, and I know they've just filmed the next 2 sequels, but I don't know if they're doing it in 3D.
Avatar has a sequel?
Yeah, I think they filmed both of them at the same time, or they've definitely finished the second one. They even released some photography prints of it, so they're moving along.
Cool.
Anyways, that has nothing to do. Oh yeah, I guess it does. Yeah, pantheism.
Yeah.
In 2 weeks, episode 5.
5.
Yeah.
Is that halfway? Are we halfway done?
Episode 5. I think. Yeah, we're more than halfway.
I think there's 7 episodes.
3.
Oh, wow.
I think we have 3 more. So yeah. So we're either halfway or just past halfway. Anyways, thanks for those of you who are joining us live and for commenting. We will see you guys in 2 weeks.